I'm Alyssa Hillary. Because I'm in Tianjin, China, you're getting a video of me talking instead of me actually coming and talking. And I'm talking about neurodiversity. Neurodiversity has a few things that you could be talking about when you say this word. There's the scientific fact that not all brains are the same, and in fact, no two brains are 100% alike. Given the number of neurons and possible connections in a brain, it's really not surprising that no two brains are exactly alike. What would be surprising is if there were two brains which were exactly alike. So that's the scientific fact. Brains are different. There's also an activism and advocacy type movement that started off as a subset of autistic advocacy. It's sort of a civil rights movement that started off with autistic people and has expanded. People talk about that with bipolar now, with ADHD, with dyslexia, with a lot of the more common things that get called learning disabilities. You'll see neurodiversity. I've also seen some related to Down syndrome, dyspraxia. It seems to be doing fairly well in the UK. They have a developmental adult neurodiversity association. There's pathology as a way of looking at how brains are wired. That's the idea that there's one right, normal, or healthy way for a human brain and a human mind to work. Or a small range where you're close enough, that's okay. And that if your neurological configuration and functioning, and as a result, your ways of thinking and behaving are substantially different from this dominant standard of normal, that is a sign of there being something wrong with you. That's pretty much the default way of looking at neurological differences at the moment, as opposed to the neurodiversity paradigm. There's three main ideas for that. One, neurodiversity, the scientific fact, diversity of brains and minds, is natural, healthy, and valuable form of human diversity. Two, there is no normal or right style of human brain or human mind, any more than there is one normal or right ethnicity, gender, or culture. And three, the social dynamics that manifest in regards to neurodiversity are similar to the ones that manifest in regards to other kinds of human diversity. So race, culture, gender, sexual orientation. This includes power relations like inequality, privilege, and oppression, as well as the dynamics where when diversity is embraced, creative potential and other good things happen in society. And for some definitions of other words that I'm going to be using, there's neurotype. This is culturally and socially constructed in that no two brains are exactly the same, but if they're close enough, they'll probably be put under the same neurotype. Examples would be neurotypical, close enough to the currently privileged, right, normal, healthy, under pathology paradigm. Autistic, bipolar, dyslexic are all examples of neurotypes. The neurotypes that are not neurotypical are considered neurominorities, and you can also use neurodivergent or neurodivergence to apply to said neurotypes that aren't neurotypical. So if you're autistic, or if you're epileptic, or if you have ADHD, or if you're some combination of all of these, you're neurodivergent, and you can talk about those things as forms of neurodivergence. Along the same lines of this neurodiversity paradigm and the privilege relationships, there's also differences of how somebody behaving in the exact same way will get constructed and viewed differently depending on the person's neurotype and depending upon the environment that they're in. This is similar to how the same behavior across genders or across cultures can be viewed very differently. A student who was considered gifted and is now at a high-level university, who lies down on the floor at a club meeting is generally going to be treated very differently than a developmentally disabled person who lies down on the floor in their school. The person who's at, say, MIT is probably not going to get in trouble. The person who's labeled as developmentally disabled is very likely to get in trouble. Or how, in many cases, a person who's labeled as autistic is often going to be held to a higher standard of eye contact because of the neurological differences that make it harder for us to do eye contact. If this neurodiversity paradigm looks a lot like the social model of disability, that's not a coincidence. The neurodiversity activist movements and the scholarship are very much built on broader disability activism and scholarship, in that, for one thing, we are, under the social model of disability, neurominorities are disabled, and we recognize this, and we build and apply the way that the dynamics work in terms of how does this specifically apply when it's a case of a neurological difference as opposed to a difference such as a mobility issue. And so it's not a coincidence. We very deliberately have been using broader disability, and yes, neurodiversity activists who are talking about the neurodiversity paradigm as opposed to groups and activists which may be simply moving the line of what's considered an acceptable brain type rather than attempting to get rid of the hierarchy. Those who are attempting to remove the hierarchy and are actually using the neurodiversity paradigm typically do recognize that we are disabled, and typically do recognize that our being disabled has more to do with societal barriers than with our actual capabilities and support needs. And similar to how disability studies in the broader sense will often talk about representation in media, both because it reveals how people are currently thinking and because it can influence how people are thinking. Neurodiversity activists and neurodiversity scholars will talk about representation of neurodivergent characters in media, both those who are explicitly labeled as such and those who, while not explicitly labeled, can easily be read as neurodivergent. The ones who are being read that way but are not explicitly labeled tend to be better representation than the ones who are specifically stated as such due to stereotypes and stigma and mythologization of neurominorities, in much the same way that a physically disabled character will often be treated as a plot device rather than as a full character. And much like this treatment of characters who are disabled but neurotypical is very closely interrelated with how real disabled people are treated. These connections can also be made when the disability is neurodivergence, when it's a neurodivergent character. When using oral speech, I tend to go on tangents and miss things, so addendums. 1. In terms of history, a lot of people think of Jim Sinclair's piece, Don't Mourn for Us, as being the start of the neurodiversity movement, even though the word neurodiversity did not get coined until several years later in an honors thesis. In its initial use, it was applied to a much narrower range than it is currently applied to. Things change. Addendum 2. Neurodiversity paradigm absolutely stands in opposition to the societal pressures of pushing everybody to have one sort of mind or to fake having that sort of mind, behaving like this neurotypical norm if they do not actually have that sort of mind. And we absolutely oppose treatments chosen by others meant to enforce this sort of conformity. We also recognize that these forces are not the same thing as an individual choosing to do something that modifies how their neurology or cognition work based on an individual preference. These are different things. Even if one influences the other, and they often do, they're not actually the same thing. Addendum 3 is a quote from High Wizardry, a young adult novel by Diane Duane, in the context of the creation of a new species. Dairine would start making them different from one another, but they were going to have to be different on the inside, too, to do any good. If some danger comes along that they have to cope with, it's no use their information processors being all the same. Whatever it is could wipe them out all at once. If they're as different as they can be, they'll have a better chance of surviving. This is, to some extent, the basic idea. It's not about one kind of information processing, one kind of sensory processing being the best. It's about needing to have as many different kinds as possible. Addendum 4. There's absolutely parallels between thinking about neurodiversity versus pathology and social model versus medical, charity, and moral models for disability, in that the medical model, the charity model, and the moral model of disability are all pathology types, and the social model is not a pathology type. It puts disability as something that's created by social forces, much like the neurodiversity paradigm says that the issues people have based on being of a different neurotype, such as by being autistic, have a lot more to do with societal barriers and discrimination than the actual status of having different needs than what's expected of a neurotypical. Addendum 5. Our minds are fine and our bodies are fine are just ways of moving the line of what's acceptable. All minds are fine, all bodies are fine. Actually take out the hierarchy that put abled folk on top, and this is a much more effective way of challenging ableism as a whole than just choosing a different subset of disabled people to be thrown under the bus in the effort to get rights for oneself or to get better representation for oneself. When we want to get out from under inequality, working together gives us more numbers, and also we're all disabled. We should not be throwing each other under the bus. The way that physically disabled people are treated when people assume cognitive disability isn't right when the person actually is neurodivergent, and opposing that as the right way to handle neurodivergence is very important.